Okay, so I'm going to talk about President Roosevelt's death today, and this was, like we mentioned yesterday, a big shock to people. So, as we mentioned yesterday, unfortunately, President Roosevelt did not live to see the end of World War II. You got to remember that he had served 3 terms and then some, and I think that any time that you're the commander-in-chief during a major war, it's wearing. I mean, it'll wear you out. It'll age you quickly. And we'll talk more about Lyndon Johnson and his aging process during the Vietnam War. And he did not live long after he left the presidency either. It's a stressful responsibility to be involved in a war. Well, because he was worn out by his vast responsibilities, President Roosevelt died suddenly on April 12, 1945 in Warm Springs, Georgia. Again, worn out by his vast responsibilities, President Roosevelt died suddenly on April 12, 1945 in Warm Springs, Georgia. Now, this was, in a way, maybe more what you're used to. People all over the United States were just stunned at his death. And radio stations, because we didn't have television at the time, across the country canceled all their broadcasts and devoted everything to Roosevelt and his memory. It's the same thing when President Kennedy was assassinated. All the things that were going on television all of a sudden stopped. The soap operas, the game shows, whatever, and everybody tuned into the events surrounding the president's assassination. Well, the same thing happened in prior years, as we all didn't have television at that time, but all these radio stations that had different broadcasts going on, different programs, simply stopped what they were doing and devoted all of the time of broadcast to talking about the death and memory of President Roosevelt. It was a big deal. Well, after the death of President Roosevelt, Vice President Harry S. Truman, who was really pretty little known, he was a senator from Missouri, but not really presidential in lots of ways, will not only assume the presidency, he will also assume the responsibility of what? At the end of World War II, which is going to be an awesome responsibility to do. He's going to have to make some choices that we'll talk about later. So, Vice President Harry S. Truman assumed both the presidency and the end of World War II. Now, we've talked about Allied victory in Europe and the Pacific Theater, and we haven't done a great job of skipping from one to the other. I basically just did the thing in Europe and then did the thing in the Pacific. So, when we first started talking about the Pacific, was there a surrender, really timeline-wise, in Europe yet? No. But we were kind of doing Europe first. Well, a lot of people don't understand that Roosevelt died April 12, 1945. Does anybody remember when VE Day was in your notes? Do you remember what day that was? What? May. So he actually died about a month before the German surrender in Europe. And he ends up dying about 4 months before we will defeat the Japanese in the Pacific to end World War II. So, realistically, Roosevelt didn't see either victory. He didn't see the victory in Europe, and he didn't see the victory in the Pacific, either one. He died a month before the Allied victory in Europe, and 4 months before the defeat of the Japanese in the Pacific that actually ended World War II. Okay, now, when we talk about victories, we're still island hopping, aren't we? We're island hopping, and the last island we hopped to and captured was what? Iwo Jima. Well, we're going to talk about a very short subtopic called Allied victory in Okinawa. Allied victory in Okinawa. It's on your ID sheet, the new yellow one. Now, how far was Iwo Jima from the Japanese mainland? 750 miles. Okinawa is going to be 300 miles from the Japanese mainland. So we are just hopping closer and closer, securing these islands for the preparation and an invasion of the mainland of Japan. That's what this whole island hopping thing is. So in June of 1945, the largest invading force in Pacific history stormed the Japanese island of Okinawa. In June of 1945, the largest invading force in Pacific history stormed the Japanese island of Okinawa. Again, just 300 miles from the mainland of Japan. So in June of 1945, the largest invading force in Pacific history stormed the Japanese island of Okinawa, just 300 miles from the mainland of Japan. Now, with our victory, the Allied victory in Okinawa, the next focus for the United States will be what? Japan itself. And this is where we're going to later get on to the decision that new President Truman's going to make. Are we going to invade the mainland because we're ready to go, or are we going to try to find a different solution to get the Japanese to surrender? Because they're tough cookies. They're willing to fight to the death. And if they're willing to fight to the death and we send American soldiers and sailors there, we're going to have casualties. Estimated 1 million. Okay, so that's something to keep in mind. Now, our next subtopic, which we'll finish up today, I think is a very important one. We probably won't get all the way through it. And that's Native Americans and their contribution to World War II. Native Americans and their contribution to World War II. And I think some of you have heard of this, okay? Some of you probably heard of this. Now, where are Native Americans prior to World War II? Where are they located? They're on reservations, okay? And so when World War II occurred, there was a mass exit of Native Americans from the reservation. They're all on the reservation prior to World War II. Once World War II commences, a mass exit of Native Americans is going to happen from the reservation. Okay? Where are the two places they're going? Why are they leaving the reservation when World War II starts? What are thousands of Native American men doing?
War.
Going to war. Okay? What are some Indian men and a lot of Indian women, why are they leaving the reservation? What are they going to go do? Work. Very good. They're going to work in the factories. So World War II prompted a mass exit of Native Americans from the reservations. Thousands of Indian men and women found work in the major cities for wartime production, whereas thousands more Native American men answered Uncle Sam's call to arms and joined the service. Okay? Now in 1940, they estimated that 90% of Native Americans that lived in the United States were located on the reservation. 90% in 1940 of all Native Americans in the United States were living on the reservation. When war came and people began to exit, that number reduced from 90% to less than 50%. So more than 40% of Native Americans that were living on the reservation prior to World War II left to either serve our country in battle or serve our country in the factories in wartime production. They estimated that about 75,000 Native American men served in the armed forces during World War II. 75,000 Native American men served in the armed forces during World War II, including who, Emily, that we just talked about? Ira Hayes, Native American. We'll talk more about him later. Emily's got some good insight on him. She's done some studying of him. Now, every Native American tribe made contributions, but the two tribes that you could say maybe made extra contributions to the war effort were the Comanche and the Navajo. The Comanche and the Navajo were two Indian tribes that made a little bit of an extra contribution to the war effort. What did they train a lot of Comanche and Navajo men to do during the war? Anybody know? They were code talkers. In other words, they used them because of their specific language to give code to the Allies so that the enemy would not understand or break in. Even if they broke in on their radio, they wouldn't know what they were saying. Now, it was kind of interesting because Comanche code talkers served the war in Europe, whereas Navajo code talkers served in the Pacific theater of the war. So the Comanche and the Navajo were the big extra contributors to the war effort as code talkers. And again, they would transmit radio messages in their native language which could not be broken by either the Germans or the Japanese. They were crucial in this war effort. Comanche code talkers served in Europe, Navajo code talkers served in the Pacific. Now, this is kind of an interesting story. Native code talkers were going to be a valuable asset for the Allies, right? But they also were going to be a very valuable asset to the Axis powers if they could get a hold of one. Because all they need is one to break the code. You see what I'm saying? So if you've got a Comanche code talker in Europe, if you capture that Comanche code talker, if you're the Axis powers, now you have the ability to break the code. How are they going to do that? Torture the hell out of them, probably. And see if they have the will to be tortured to death before they give up the code. Now, I'd like to think that everybody has the same mentality, but do you think that every Navajo or every Comanche, if caught, would have not broken under torture? I don't think anybody can answer that unless you're the one being tortured. Everybody has different pain tolerance. So, because of this, these code talkers in both Europe and in the Pacific were partnered up with another soldier for protection. Okay, so if Morgan is a Navajo code talker in the Pacific, they would partner him up with me so that I could protect him from not only getting killed, but from not getting captured. Because if he gets captured, we risk the entire code in the Pacific being compromised. On the other hand, if I got with Morgan and it looked like we were going to be captured and we couldn't do anything about it, I was given orders to exterminate Morgan to make sure that he did not get captured alive. That was part of the deal with the soldier that got partnered up with a code talker. If you thought that that individual was going to be caught, you would shoot them and then get captured or shoot yourself. I don't know. But your orders were not to let your partner, code talker, ever be captured by the enemy. Your job was to shoot that person first. Now, there's a great movie I'd love to show you, but again, it's got too much profanity in it. If I can find the softened version, I will, called Wind Talkers. Have you ever seen it? Have you seen it? It's a great movie with Nicolas Cage that portrays this very, very well. If you get bored, again, besides Patriots Day, dig up Code Talkers if you want to know some history behind these Navajo in the Pacific. Well, after World War II, and they made a tremendous contribution to the war effort, tremendous. Native American code talkers returned back to the reservation and suffered some very difficult economic times. And jobs were very scarce. Opportunities for education or job training for these Native Americans was not good. Even though they served their country and served it well, they were discriminated against. There was racism towards Indian people, still is today. But these people were not treated as well as maybe they should have been for the effort that they put out as code talkers. You had the same thing you had with African Americans after World War II. Indian veterans couldn't even eat and drink in some establishments, couldn't stay in hotels, wouldn't be served because they were Indian. Sad when you think that they put their lives on the line and had such an impact on the successful victories in both Europe and the Pacific by the job they carried. Some couldn't even vote in state or national elections. I mean, this was a sad, unfortunate situation. It took until December of 1971 for the United States of America to stand up and give these people the credit they had coming or treat them like they should be. And that happened in December of 1971 when President Nixon presented Native American code talkers with a certificate of appreciation from the United States of America. Did they get any? It wasn't at all like the internment camps. What happened to those Japanese Americans when they thanked them? Gave them money. They didn't give these Native American code talkers anything, but they did finally give them a certificate of appreciation, but it took them until December of 1971 to do so. And President Nixon was good. He thanked them for their patriotism and their resourcefulness and their courage and all this type of thing, but there was no monetary part of that at all. Now you think about this, what did these brave Native American veterans do, these code talkers? First of all, they gave the United States Marine Corps the only breakable means of battlefield communication in the history of our country. The only unbreakable means of battlefield communication in the history of our country. That's one thing they gave the United States Marine Corps. The only unbreakable means of battlefield communication in our nation's history. Which led to saving what? Thousands of American GI lives. So I think it's incredibly underestimated what we owe Native American code talkers for their efforts in World War II. Because the code became unbreakable and was never broken, thousands of American lives were saved during World War II. I'll just tell you this, it's kind of an interesting story, write it down if you want. After World War II, an unnamed Japanese general admitted that the most highly skilled Japanese cryptographers had not been able to decipher the Marines' messages. They had the smartest people in Japan trying to break this code, couldn't do it. And after the Japanese general was informed that the code was based on Native American language, he was quoted as saying, "Thank you. That is a puzzle I thought would never be solved." They never did know what they were up against until after the war, when they explained to this surrendered Japanese general that the code that they were using was based on Native American language. He was just puzzled. He thanked them for solving the mystery. He thought he never would ever find out what had happened. So I think that's a very, very important time period in history. And tomorrow we're going to talk about a group of airmen that were very important in World War II that were black. Anybody know who they are? Tuskegee Airmen. Have you ever heard of them before? An all-black squadron of pilots that we'll talk about tomorrow. Huh? Oh, are they? All right.